He was the cleverest of them all. And this is what he argues in that first book. He said, you're all fooling yourselves. And I know, because I was one of you. And then he says, he basically argues that real knowledge is not all of these words. It's something much deeper than that. The words are necessary, but they are only a necessary. They are not a sufficient cause for the purpose of this. And then he will argue that the real purpose of this religion is to know God. It is about ma'rifah. It's about realization of God. But he says, but I'm not going to write about what he calls mukashafa, about the unveilings that will occur to people that take this religion seriously. What he says is, I'm going to write about mu'amala. I'm going to write about how you can achieve this state. And here's my book. And I divide it into 4 sections, quartos. The first section is going to be about the secrets of why we do all these things. What he says is, don't be content with simply doing wudu. There are Muslims now, when they go into the bathroom, it's just this quick thing, and they see it as something they have to do before they do wudu. My own teacher, Murabt al-Hajj in the Sahara, I used to do wudu next to him, and he, on average, would take about 10 minutes to do wudu. It was really quite extraordinary to watch him do wudu. And I realized from his wudu that for him it was an act of ibadah. He was not simply doing a ritual. He was actually experiencing, because we know that the Prophet ﷺ said, when you rinse your mouth, the sins of your tongue flow out with the water. In the Shafi'i madhab, the water of wudu is considered polluted. You can't actually use it. You have to dump it. Water plants with it, but you can't drink it or use it, because it's polluted by the sins that have been washed away. And so Imam al-Ghazali is arguing that there are secrets to purification. And he says that when the Prophet said, At-tahur shatur al-iman, purification is half of this religion, he said, do not think that he is talking about this water ritual that we do. He is talking about purifying the heart. This is what he's talking about. And this is only symbolic of that purification. And he talked about a man, the Prophet ﷺ said, what do you say about a man who lives beside a river and bathes in the river 5 times a day? Will you see any filth on him? And they said, certainly not, Ya Rasulullah. And he said, this is like the man who washes himself and then prays 5 times a day. This is what he is doing. In other words, what the outward washing is to the body, the inward reality is to the soul. And then he argues about prayer and what the purpose of prayer is. He says prayer is entering into the presence. And the reason that you say Allahu Akbar is you are pushing this world away from you and putting it behind you, and you are entering into a state of presence with your Lord. And then he says, you begin, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise be to the Lord of the worlds, the merciful, the compassionate. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, the sovereign of the day of judgment, or the master of the day of judgment. And then you speak directly. This is in Arabic called iltifat, where you move from a third person tense, what they call khitab al-ghaib, to khitab al-hadir, where you move from speaking to somebody who's absent to speaking to somebody who's present. Iyaka na'budu. To you alone we worship. Iyaka nasta'in. To you alone we seek help. That this is, he says, this is what the Fatiha is. It's to enter into the presence of your Lord. It's not just to go through these motions, this perfunctory act that you have to do 5 times a day. That this is about coming to intimate discourse with your Lord. And then you speak to your Prophet directly. Assalamu alayka ayyuhan nabi. Peace be upon you. That's not salamu alayhi, assalamu alayka, because you understand that there is a spiritual presence. There's a spiritual presence. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Tu'radu alayya a'malukum." I see your actions. This is a sahih hadith in Al-Bazar. I see your actions in the grave. فَإِذَا وَجَدْتُ خَيْرًا حَمِدْتُ اللَّهِ. وَإِذَا وَجَدْتُ شَرًّا أَسْتَغْفَرْتُ لَكُمْ. If I see good, I praise God, that these are my people, that I taught them to do good and they're doing good. And if I see you doing wrong, I ask forgiveness. He doesn't curse us. He doesn't say, why aren't they doing good? He asks forgiveness for us. So Imam al-Ghazali then talks about fasting and zakat. What are the meanings? And hajj, the real meanings behind these things that we do and take for granted. And then he moves to the second, which is the second quarter of this ihya. And the architecture of the ihya is quite extraordinary if you examine it. He moves to the second quarter and he shows that you have daily things that you do. We were talking today about sacred monotony. This idea of doing these things that we do every day and they become our practice. Like the master archer who goes out every day and practices until it becomes effortless. He is no longer present. The beginner's mind is a wonderful mind, they say, because the beginner's mind is really the mind that has arrived. Because the beginner is always present. Because they're so worried about getting it right. If you watch a beginner driver, I love when I drive by these schools, these driving schools. I love watching these people learning how to drive. They're usually about 16, and they're in there, and they're so present because they have the beginner's mind. You see, after a while, they like everybody else, they're falling asleep at the wheel, right? They go from one place to another, and they don't know how they got there. But they've done that trip so many times because they're asleep at the wheel. The lights are on, but nobody's home. This is most people. We're somnambulant. We're sleepwalking through life. We're not present. We're not present in our meetings when we meet each other. We go through the motions. We shake the hands. We don't really hear the names. When I lived with the Bedouin in Mauritania, one of the things that really floored me about some of the Salihin amongst them, one lady, and a very dear lady to me. She was the wife of my teacher, and she died a few years ago, Maryam bint Boueba. And I wrote a piece about her called Another Mother of the Believers. Maryam asked me when I first arrived there in 1984, she asked me if I had family, and I said, yeah. And she said, what are their names? And I said, well, I've got my mother's name is Elizabeth, and my father's name is David, and my brother's name, I have two brothers. One's name is John, and the other's Troy. And then I have 4 sisters. I have Kathleen, Patricia, Elizabeth, who's now called Nabila, and Mariah. And I didn't think anything of it. After I left that period, there were 10 years before I went back. When I first saw Maryam, after 10 years, she said to me, كيف ديفيد؟ كيف إليزابيث؟ كيف جون؟ كيف تروي؟ كيف Mariah, Patricia? And she named all of my family. And it was such a dagger to the heart, because I realized she wasn't just asking to chat. She wanted to know their names. And she internalized their names. And 10 years later, she could recall names that she'd never heard in her life, because they're not Arabic names, and she only knew Arabic. And I was just so stunned, but she was a present human being. She did dhikr all the time. That was her life. She spent her life serving the students of that place. She knew every name of every student that ever came to that. And Aisha met her and remembers her, She was present. And this was from practice. This was from just the monotony of every day working on your presence with God. Because when you're present with God, you're present with the creation of God. You start noticing things like the wind in the trees. You start noticing the subtleties of everything that's around us. It becomes real. And this is what Imam al-Ghazali is arguing. And so he has the book of, he begins it with eating and drinking. We eat with no presence anymore. People used to take time before they ate and said grace. Even in this country, people would stop before they ate and they would thank their Lord for the gifts which they were about to receive. This was common practice, being present with food. People used to be present when they cooked food. They cooked food with love. I had one teacher, one of my teachers, Omar Malahji, his wife would cook her food, doing prayer on the Prophet the entire time with niyatu shifa, that God would make that food a healing for the people that ate it and make the energy that they derive from it used for worshiping Allah. They would only buy from grocers in Medina that they knew prayed 5 times in the prayer in the masjid. They would go out and pick their own animals and sacrifice them because they didn't want to buy meat from these butchers that they didn't know how they were treating the animals. This is a real family that I have visited over the years. It is a fact, and I guarantee you many people have experienced this. If you go and have eaten a full meal, and you go there and they serve you food in the house of Omar Malahji, you will not get indigestion by eating a second meal immediately after that at his house. And many people have testified to this because they will force you to eat. They will say, Kul, kul, kul. They say, Kul karrijal wa ibka jimal. You know, eat like men and drink like camels. That food was made with presence. We forget, people don't have energy anymore. How is your food being manufactured? How is it being grown? How is it being cooked? Because this is where energy comes from. It comes from, that's the sabab for the energy that we live on is caloric. It's heat derived from these means that God has given us. So he talks about being present when you eat, chewing your food, being grateful, not putting another morsel in until you finish chewing the morsel that's in your mouth, because he says this is from gluttony. To don't eat quickly, to eat with gratitude. Never mention death at the table. He says death is not an appropriate, because he said if your heart is alive and people mention death at eating, you should lose your appetite, and if you don't, it's a sign that your heart is dead. Wendell Berry the other night talked about people now reading about massacres or watching them on television while they're eating their dinners. And it has no effect on them. This is from deadened hearts. We're no longer feeling.